This hourly segment is brought to you by IDT. Eliminate paper files with the IoT Smart Connected Scanning Device. Find them at ready4IDT.com.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Merry Christmas.
On AM 560.
Ho, ho, ho.
The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Before we get to matters of pardons and prosecutions, I did want to set up our next guest with a question about the academy, colleges and universities. Joel Kotkin had an interesting piece in Spiked Online. Kotkin is academic at Chapman University in California. 78% of professors in America voted for Kamala Harris. The University of California at Berkeley blames Trump's rise on racism and sexism. Wesleyan University President Michael Roth calls on universities to abandon, quote, institutional neutrality, unquote, for activism in the Trump era, predictably comparing neutral professors to those who accommodated the Nazis. We know the story of the distribution of viewpoints on campus. By 2017, 60% of the faculty on college campuses identified either as far left or liberal, compared to 12% as conservative, so 5 to 1. That has increased. The ratio of liberal faculty to conservative more than doubled, and this was occurring as America was actually getting slightly more conservative. We know about the disgusting hatred that is fomented on college campuses, particularly over the last year and a half, anti-Semitism. We also see these numbers, an Emerson survey that came out yesterday, I believe, on the assassination, the cold-blooded killing of the United Healthcare CEO.
Yeah.
18 to 29-year-olds, 41% said it was acceptable or somewhat acceptable. 40% said it wasn't. A plurality of 18 to 29-year-olds find shooting someone in the back over a policy disagreement in a public street acceptable.
What happened with just throwing pies in their face? Remember, like Bill Gates said that, and the CEO of Enron, people would throw pies in their face. Now it's escalated to murder.
Yeah, there's a lot of justifications for political violence or politically related violence, just as during the summer of 2020 and the rioting. Those weren't people looting. Those were people engaged in symbolic takings as an expression of revolt against oppression, don't you know?
Remember the black lady from BLM in Chicago saying, take it. You know, if you can take that stuff from Gucci, that's yours.
So this nihilism that is an increasing feature of our country, and I think arguably incubated and incubating in our alleged institutions of higher learning, I would think that would be an issue that deserves more attention than perhaps it's getting. Professor Richard Epstein is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Yes, why is it that you want to begin with such a cheery talk?
Merry Christmas and Happy
Christmas
Hanukkah.
is a week away.
Yeah,
right.
Yes, I mean, look, what you say is true and false. Let me kind of put it in a grim perspective. If you were to go back, say, 10 years, where this stuff was beginning to boil up, you would say, in effect, that maybe, 0.5% of people on campus had those views. And now what happens is there's an epidemic, and maybe 2 to 3 times that happens. So you have to ask the half-empty, half-full question. To what extent the 1.5% of the students representative of everything that goes up on campus? And what happens is we know, because of people like you rightly pointed to this stuff, and so these 1.5% get 95% of the attention. In the meantime, all the kids who are working in their labs and writing their theses and figuring out how to do constructive stuff are left to one side. So the tragedy is it's that the good kids are completely drowned out by the bad kids. Now, the other half of the problem is one that I think you're right. I grew up in 1960s and so forth, and there was a huge anti-Vietnam movement, if you remember, and so forth, and there was a shooting at Kent State, and there were all sorts of rebellions out there, but it was a big difference. In those days, it turns out the establishment inside was relatively conservative. It was the students on the outside who were a little crazy. And I could still remember the picture of one of the great academic geniuses of the mid-century, Clark Kerr, going in front of a rabble bunch of students in the early 1960s in a seersucker suit, wondering, what am I doing here and how am I supposed to deal with those kinds of people? Well, the problem that you have today is kind of a different one. It's the madmen are in the house. They're the ones who are running it. All the kids who were crazy 40 years ago are now in charge of a lot of these institutions, saying the kind of lame-brain remarks that the president of Wesleyan started to put out. And when you have those people on the inside, it becomes extremely difficult to figure out what you're supposed to do. So let me kind of give you a hint of what is happening, because most of us who are on the sort of libertarian, conservative, classical, liberal side, small government property rights side, think it's almost impossible to take over any of the institution in which these people are entrenched. And so what you see is people are starting to change this. So I'm going to become, as of next year, a member of Kiwatas, which is a new operation at the University of Texas, in a new school at the University of Texas, which is dominated by classical liberal types. There's no way you could take over the whole university, but what you could do if you have enlightened administrators is start an island and then grow the island and make it larger. And there are places like New College in Florida that are trying to do the same thing. Because what people have come to recognize is the establishment is just too bad. And the hope is that what you will do is if you're going to give grants to Harvard, you make sure that they go to a particular lab, not the general expenses. And then you note that at places like Harvard and Columbia and so forth and Yale, alumni contributions are way down. And it's the alumni are the only ones who can force it. Because if you remember, these are people who essentially, their average alumni is 20, 30, 40 years out of college, and they have a very different set of values. And they do it with their pocketbooks by saying not another dime ever for places like this unless they reform. And so I think the landscape is a little bit more scrambled than these statistics give you. And I think there was actually some ray of hope here, there, and the other place on the horizon. But the point that you made is essentially still a valid one. You cannot, if the only people who care about politics vote by, say, 89 or 90% for Democrats and opposed to Republicans, and then think that their mission is to make sure that the other 10% doesn't have a chance to speak, then these institutions are going to be gone. And the issue is, well, what happened? Harvard is much better today than it was when Claudine Gay was president. That doesn't mean that it's good enough. Columbia, we don't know because the old president quit because she couldn't move anybody, and the new president, well, we're going to have to see. So I think the answer is what the Trump administration can do and what it should do is to make sure that when it starts giving grants, it looks closely as to whether or not they're being used for acts of rebellion or for serious academic endeavors and research. And if you can change the federal grant culture, that's worth a lot. So one of the most important appointments is a good friend of mine named Jay Bhattacharya, who's going to take over the National Institutes of Health. That has a budget of around $50 billion. And, I mean, you could spend it all for doing research on transfer gender stuff and one thing or another, or you could go back to basic sciences. And what you have to do is to use the power of the grant to direct the money to things that are much more constructive than the things that you see today. And the difficulty, or the reason why it was so important that Kamala Harris lost, is she may be a personal cipher, but the people behind her are not. And they would just continue to accentuate the trend that was taking place beforehand. And if we had 4 more years of this kind of stuff, we would find it very, very uncomfortable to live in a world in which whenever you disagree with the government on any issue, you are guilty of misinformation told by a bunch of people who are largely illiterate about the very subject on which they wish to deal. So it's a tight battle, but I think the tug of war is moving slowly, not inexorably, but slowly in the right direction.
Let's turn our attention to legal matters, starting with the decision this week by Judge Merchan in Manhattan to not dismiss the case against President Trump under a claim that the Supreme Court's decision in the presidential immunities case would obviate the verdict in his. So what happens with that case pending sentencing?
Well, what happens is it's going to go into abeyance. That is, there are 2 sorts of immunities that you have to have. And one of them is based upon presidential immunity for the acts that were done. And he said, not unreasonably, that if you are paying off somebody because of a marital dispute or a story of that, it's not associated with your official duties, even under the broad test of the United States Supreme Court. But there's a second element, which is every bit as important, which says that the president shall take care to see that the law be faithfully executed. And you cannot do that in jail. And so what has to happen is what Bragg wanted to do, which is to postpone this thing for at least 4 years until it's over. And then he says, I could go back and bring the case again. And the issue is, I'm not thrilled with that, because I think, in fact, that if you're in 4 years and you know that there's a sentence awaiting you after you get out, it's going to influence a lot of things that you say or do in the interim, for fear that somebody like Bragg, who's completely unscrupulous on this, will say, well, look, you know he was surely wrong back in 2012. Look at the things that he just said in 2027. And I think, in effect, you should just end it right now and just go. If he gets it, by the way, the verdict is very suspect. They stitch together a bunch of innocent acts and treat them as though they're one giant felony. This was something that the federal government refused to do before he got into office. There are real questions of whether or not Mershon is hopelessly compromised, because his own bias is pretty clear. And also, his daughter is a key operative in the Democratic Party. And that's close enough to say it throws suspicion on you. And the general rule when there's suspicion, as a matter of legal ethics, is if you are one out of 50 judges in that court, and there's some taint about you, why does anybody want to actually go so close to the line when he could recuse himself and they could give it to somebody who doesn't have any of these complications, which is what he should have done. And I think that argument can actually win by the time it gets to the court above him. So to call Trump a convicted felon, what they can say is there's a jury verdict against him, but it is not a final judgment in any sense of the word. And if you want to renew this stuff, it's going to take you at least another year or 2 or 3 in order to sort out the mess that was left behind. Now, this can go to the United States Supreme Court, and they could decide, quite reasonably, I think, that this thing just has to end, because it is an indirect compromise, even if delayed, on what goes. I might add that in the civil case, if you remember, that was brought against Bill Clinton, they said, oh, you can't dismiss the case, it's civil. You can take discovery, but you just can't get a trial. It was a terrible mistake. When you have anybody who's in public office, you don't want to be put under examination or discovery or anywhere else. And so what happened is you get discovery, he says some things which are probably fraudulent or at least misleading, and then you get an impeachment trial. You don't need this. Any lawyer will tell you that discovery is every bit as dangerous as a trial. Mm-hmm. And when you got the case, it was Justice Stevens who ran it, and he's an antitrust litigator, and I don't think he had the slightest clue of how it is that ordinary people, when fraud is an issue and integrity is an issue, respond when they're given depositions. So he just made the wrong kind of decision. He should have postponed everything and said, what you can do is gather all the evidence that you want, put it into a file, we'll pull the statute of limitations, that is, we won't bar you by the statute of limitations, and then when it's all done, you can start the case at that particular time, knowing that there's a real temporal gap, but at least leaving the president free of the temptation to lie while he's sitting in a deposition, which if he does, the consequences of the lie are trivial about the affair. It's the way in which it disrupts the operation of the government for months. And we do not want a president having that kind of burden on top of him. I said the same thing about Joe Biden. As you know, when I've been on this show before, I was not in favor of bringing an impeachment action against him. And now that he's gone, there is nothing you should do about his presidency. But I'm also against, at this particular time, given his obvious incompetence, of going after all the things which were highly dubious and probably illegal when he was out of office in the Trump years, essentially peddling influence of his son Hunter. I just don't think this country needs things like that. To give you yet another illustration, Netanyahu is running a war, and these morons are deciding to charge him with undue influence and seeking political support in 2012. Why is it that he has to spend half his day worrying about that when he has the Syrians, the Iranians, right, the Lebanese, Hezbollah, the Soviets, the Russians, rather? These guys are out there. That's what you want his attention on. So I'm a strong opponent of doing any kind of legal warfare with somebody who is in office, and I'm against it whether it's about acts that happened in office, before office, or strangely enough, even after office. I just don't think that it's worth the while. We have to have a rule of law. Everybody says that. It turns out there's absolutely no effective legal constraints on a prosecutor. So he can be above the rule of law, and it's extremely difficult to displace him. They have to bring elaborate procedures for discipline. For the most part, they failed. And what we have to do is to get back to a more sensible culture on these kinds of issues and to do it in a bipartisan way. So I'm very much down on Marshall. I think he's taking this case. I think most of his rulings were clearly wrong. And I think at this particular point, he's right on the technical stuff with respect to immunity, but wrong on everything else.
All right, Professor Epstein, I wanted to ask you about Donald Trump's lawsuit against Ann Stelzer. She's the pollster from the Des Moines Register, and he claims she rigged the Iowa polls to influence the 2024 election. But what are the damages? Because he handily won the election.
It's a form of defamation and election interference. So if you start looking at the consumer fraud statutes, they often say we have to deal with consumer irregularities, even if they don't result in harm, because if we don't deter those events that are basically harmless, we're going to get more of these events, and some of them will really call harm. This is a very controversial proposition, and it also requires that she acted with malice aforethought, and I think that's rather difficult. What was striking about it is I remember seeing 3 points ahead in Iowa. What's going on here?
Yeah.
And, I mean, the actions that everybody else said was what she's doing is she's saying the Democrats are once, and the Republicans might as well stay home, is the way in which it was being treated not uncharitably. It will be thrown out as a case, I'm pretty sure. But her reputation, which was extremely high, has been tattered by just a colossal blunder. 16 points off, essentially a couple of days before an election. You got to be smoking something.
Yeah, well, it put her out of being the Des Moines Register pollster. So there's that. I wanted to get to something else too, and that's the with the criminal referral issued by the House Oversight Subcommittee yesterday on Liz Cheney, and based on what you said before. Then I take it that you would be opposed to both a preemptive pardon of Liz Cheney as well as a criminal investigation into Liz Cheney for federal witness tampering, as suggested by that House committee report. Is that right?
Yeah, I just want to keep this whole thing going. I mean, there is a serious issue. If you go back and read the pardons clause, the issue is, can you issue a blanket pardon, which seems to be the statement that everybody else has. And now let me just read the clause and then explain to you what the difficulty is. The president shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment, right? Well, there's a word missing there, right? He shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses actually committed against the United States, offenses charged but not convicted against the United States, or for anything which we don't know whether or not it is or not an offense. And so the word reprieve only applies in those cases where somebody has already been convicted. And what you can do under those circumstances, the president can basically postpone the death sentence to get further examinations and so forth. But a reprieve cannot apply in any way, shape, or form for an offense that has not yet been committed. So you put the two things together. Why is it that the pardon power, which is very broad as it is, can be used to deal with things where there's no conviction? Well, a perfectly respectable argument is that the guy is now being charged, and you know that you're going to let him go, spare everybody the pain of a trial, and pardon him while the case is ongoing. But where do you get the power under this thing to give preemptive pardons for events that have never been charged? I just don't see it. People are worried about the pardon power being too broad, and it's certainly too broad if you say to Hunter Biden, well, they offer all sorts of things, but we don't know what they are. It says offenses against the United States. Well, there has to be something that was committed or charged at the very least. And in this case, all they're doing is giving blanket pardons out like the Christmas candies. And I don't think, in fact, that you can do that, actually.
Well, it's a persuasive argument, but it's been done in the case of Hunter Biden. It may be done in other cases.
No, that's wrong.
Well,
pardon. And what happens is somebody wants to charge him with something that was not listed amongst the previous offenses. They go to court to do it. He pleads the pardon as a defense, and the court denies it.
Right.
So, I mean, it's not over.
No.
Because, look,
well, it's not prospective, but it's still preemptory. If there was anything covered still alive under the statute of limitations in any particular law that he had violated, then he's got the pardon in his back pocket.
Yes, but again, the statute of limitations in criminal fraud and tax cases is waived, so he can't plead that. And therefore what happens is he has to plead that the pardon is valid. And if you can't give preemptive pardons for events that have never been identified or charged, then the pardon does not reach that case and the prosecution can go forward. This is not the standard view, but as I was thinking about it, nobody reads reprieves and pardons as part of the same sentence. They just ignore the reprieve. But it can only take place after conviction.
Well, just on the Liz Cheney thing, and this is more of a legal culture question because, you don't want this lawfare going back and forth and continuing to escalate. But by the same token, I mean, if you just ignore that criminal referral on Liz Cheney and say, well, we just don't want to go back. She was a member of Congress. We don't want to go back and relitigate. If you don't punish people legitimately, where there's legitimate basis to do a criminal investigation, and you don't hold anybody accountable for potential breaches of criminal law, then you encourage the other side that was the preemptive practitioner of lawfare to do so again next time they have the opportunity.
Well, I think that's half right, which is why this is a hard question. But remember, what happened to Liz Cheney? She went back home and she got wronged. She lost her political career over this. And remember, this was a woman with a very promising career going forward. She was my student, in fact. And, even when she was a young woman, you could tell that she had a political instinct. And her political career is effectively over. So what happens is you have to weigh against the thing that you mentioned, which is surely a valid consideration. The other consideration, which is the social and political sanctions, are so enormous. The question is it going to really make a difference if you then subject to a prisoner crime, to a criminal prosecution and put her in jail for 30 days, or give a suspended sentence? I tend to think I'm against that. But here's the question that's really critical, and which you do. There's a huge amount of irregularities with Biden and Son in the years between 2017 and 2021. And these are not protected in any way, shape, or form. And are they subject to criminal prosecution? My answer in that case is probably yes. But then you have the other problem. The guy who wanted to prosecute Biden said he's not competent to stand trial. And I certainly agree with that. I think he's a zombie at this particular point. Hunter is capable of standing trial. And so I would say the following thing. If what you're doing is not involved in an official investigation, like the January 6th committee, but is involved with your private activities that take place between it, I go back to what Judge Marshall said, and there's no immunity whatsoever associated with these things. And in this case, I do think that the criminal sanctions start to make sense. And, and if I'm right about what I said about the pardon power, it doesn't extend to events that go back to 2014 for Hunter Biden if they've never been charged or articulated. And statute of limitations is waived because of the fraud. And so it's a kind of delicate balance in one way or another. In general, I would rather not have people be sued for the irregularities in concert with their areas. Other situation that you could do with respect to judges, it won't happen with Marchand, is somebody can say, look, this guy should be subject to discipline because he's completely biased in the case. He has absolute immunity from suit, but he doesn't have immunity from discipline. And indeed, one of the reasons why we give people immunity from a lawsuit is that because we know the disciplinary sanction is there. Just as a general matter, there are very few areas that are more tricky than figuring out what immunities are with respect to people who have official jobs. And that's why there's so much complications here.
Professor Richard Epstein is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law, Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you as always. Appreciate your time.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yep, have a good one. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. Coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer.
All right, now for something completely different. Mark Vansell, former sports writer for the Sun-Times, covering the Bulls. Remember when they were a basketball team? He's got a new book on Jordan. We're going to talk to him about it at 8:38.
But now let's head into the newsroom. Here's
8:34, 30 degrees. Israel and Hamas